Rather than just being the worst books of the year, these are books that I have strong opinions about. There are some books I read that I disliked and then completely forgot. But these ones are going to shape my reading going forwards, or are something that I feel like I need to rant about. The first one is The Neighbourhood by Vargas Llosa, who is a very famous Peruvian writer. And I read this book because last year I went to Peru. There are some vlogs that I will leave in the cards above. The Neighbourhood is set in the 90s under the reign of Alberto Fujimori, who some consider to be a dictator. This book follows a wealthy businessman and his wife and his best friend and his best friend's wife as they get involved in some sort of shady business that eventually leads to them butting up against the secret police and the darker side of the Fujimori regime. It also follows a person who publishes a kind of gossip newspaper, whose journalists end up trying to uncover some of this darkness of the regime and the effects that that has on the newspaper because of the censorship and the violence of the regime. As it's in this video, you can tell I really hated this book. I've since discovered that Vargas Llosa is famous for being a misogynist, so reading this work was never really going to go my way, but it definitely was an incredibly misogynistic book. If we ignore that side of things, it was also a super predictable political thriller that had followed every beat that you would expect. It was never particularly suspenseful or interesting, and the attempts at humour fell completely flat. But including the fact that it is so misogynistic, every single female character is sexually harassed, her physical description is the only thing that is important about her, that harassment is seen as normal, and also that it has the worst sex scenes that are clearly just a male fantasy of a lesbian relationship. There are a lot of sex scenes between two women which eventually evolve into a threesome with one of the husbands, and that is when the sex becomes truly orgasmic, is once this self-insert of Vargas Llosa gets involved. So cringy and difficult to read, like it has no relevance to real life and it just reads exactly like a fantasy. The whole thing reads like a self-insert fantasy about being a kind of vigilante justice person and being maybe a little uncouth, maybe a little egotistical, but really just such a cool guy. And I never want to read anything by him ever again. One that I made an entire video of is All the Light We Cannot See by Anthony Doerr, so I'll leave that linked in the cards above, and I'll try not to go on in case you have seen that video already. This is World War II historical fiction, and I have talked about many times why I dislike World War II historical fiction. I feel like it often romanticizes that period, which was of course incredibly brutal for a lot of people. It also makes a virtue of that brutality, particularly with Holocaust fiction, is often non-Jewish, non-Roma people retelling a story of the Holocaust for the backdrop of their own characters and for making their own stakes higher, rather than with any real engagement with the time period. This one is not Holocaust fiction, although the Holocaust does show up briefly, because of course everything about World War II does, and it only shows up in order to make our main Nazi soldier more sympathetic. It is just as schmaltzy and cringy to read as I had come to expect. The writing itself is a little grandiose for the actual story that it is telling. The characters are rather flat, and whilst I am glad that it did not really delve into what I thought it was, which was a romance between a French girl and a Nazi soldier, it does have storylines that are completely pointless. Like, there is a kind of magical realist dual thing that doesn't seem to make any sense, and the building of these tiny houses that are like intricate and detailed and again add nothing to the story and don't really need to be there. I think overall it was written with such blatant heartstring tugging intended that it just doesn't work for me, and any of the attempts at looking at ideas of class and the use of the poor as cannon fodder during the war, I think that was really particularly well explored. It was instead just, look at this one nice Nazi man. It succeeded at being exactly what it wanted to be, and that was a schmaltzy bestseller. But for me, it didn't achieve anything beyond that, and that is not something that I am interested in. One that I read and I was really disappointed by was The Gospel According to the New World by Maryse Conde. I read this when I was reading the International Booker Prize, which is awarded to works translated into English in the previous year. And this book was so poorly written that I was really surprised it made it into the shortlist. I had read Maryse Conde before, I had read Segu, and again, whilst that writing wasn't particularly special, I did enjoy the kind of the epic quality and the look at storytelling that was in that novel. This novel is about a boy who is born in an unnamed Caribbean island, and he is there are some suggestions that he might be Jesus reborn, or just Jesus, a Messiah, some sort of Messiah. He is born in a barn, and there are donkeys and things, and various miracles seem to happen over the course of his life. And it is a retelling of the Gospels from the perspective of colonization, like a decolonial gospel novel. But I think that, one, as I've said, the writing was poor, and two, I don't think this novel really knew what it was doing or what choice it was making, because whilst we were retelling this gospel, it didn't make it clear whether Jesus existed or not in this book. It wasn't really certain about that, because there were moments when the Bible was referenced, when Jesus was referenced, but at the same time, although everyone is calling this boy a Messiah, they're not mentioning Jesus or anything like that to him, or how his, turning water into wine is the same thing that Jesus did. It is definitely a book written from a religious person's perspective, with a very heavy focus on that, and of course, you kind of expect that going in, but I don't think it really did anything with this story. I don't think it really knew what it was going for with this story, what it was trying to do, why it was being told. Yeah, I found it a really disjointed novel that didn't make much sense. One I have ranted about a lot is Pod by Laline Paul, and this one was on the Women's Prize shortlist. I actually have another one on the Women's Prize shortlist to rant about as well. The reason that I feel like this novel is completely mismarketed is because it is marketed as literary fiction, and it reads like YA fantasy. It is told from the perspective of several different sea creatures, particularly a couple of dolphins, as one of them is a spinner dolphin who loses connection to her pod and ends up with these, I think they're bottlenose dolphins, I can't remember, and another bottlenose dolphin who is being used by the military as a working dolphin for them. I don't read a lot of fantasy, and one of the reasons I don't read a lot of fantasy is that I don't care for world building, and this novel spent a lot of time building ideas of dolphin language and dolphin culture, and it read like Laline Paul had done a lot of research by zoologists about dolphins, about the behavioural patterns of dolphins, and decided to build that into a world in a way that felt not quite coherent, and that is something that completely doesn't interest me. But outside of that, the writing was just so earnest and so overblown and over the top and so enraging to read, and not enraging in a getting angry at the injustices she is talking about, but getting angry at the obviousness and the repetitiveness and the cliche language, the really tired way of telling this story, and a very black and white morality, and a very tired tropey story. And I thought that I didn't really understand why this book had gotten so much hype. The cover of it and the description of it made it a book that I didn't think I'd ever want to read, and then lots of people were really hyping it up. So I thought maybe it would be clever and it would be interesting, but it really did remind me of reading something like that book by Stephanie Meyer about the aliens that are in your brain. The Host, is that what that was called? That was the the vibe of the writing and the level of the social commentary. And I'm sorry, I'm just not interested in reading YA dystopia from the perspective of dolphins. The next one is definitely more on the disappointing than bad side of things, and that is The Furrows by Namwalli Serpell. The reason it was so disappointing is how much I loved The Old Drift by Namwalli Serpell, which was their multi-generational family saga, and they made me like that, despite the fact that that is a genre I specifically don't like. So I was really excited to read her new book, which is about a girl who lost her brother one day when she was supposed to be keeping an eye on him. He disappeared, and her mother's obsession with the fact that he might still be alive, and the guilt that she feels about the fact that he is lost, and her and her father's certainty that he is dead. And the way that it begins is so interesting and so well told. The first line is, "I don't want to tell you what happened, I want to tell you how it felt." And so it goes through telling you multiple different stories about how it felt to lose her brother, and this concept of the way the story is told to oneself and the way that the different members of the family construct the story. And I really, really enjoyed that first half. But then the second half, it changes. It becomes something entirely different. It changes perspective and it changes genre. It becomes almost a thriller and starts dealing with very different topics like true crime and grief and policing, and it just completely loses its way. I don't think it's particularly good at telling that story, and I don't think it's particularly interesting either. And it's really jarring to read when you've been reading a completely different story for the first half of the novel, and there has been this sort of discomforting feeling and this strangeness to it, to suddenly become so concrete and so firm, but not about the things that it was being vague about before, just changing completely into an alternate direction. And ultimately, I don't think that that worked. I also really didn't like The Miniaturist by Jessie Burton, and I think I could have worked that out for myself before I read this book. I picked up this book years ago when it first came out in paperback, and I just never got round to reading it. And since I picked it up, my taste in historical fiction has changed or firmed up. This book was very much of its time, and I could see why it was a bestseller in the mid-2010s. It is historical fiction set in the 17th century in the Netherlands about a girl who marries into this family. She doesn't know the man that she has married, and he is absent for a lot of the time, but he has left a miniature version of the house that she lives in to help her become to help her run this household, and strange things start showing up in this house that reflect what is going on in the household as she gets to know it. And she lives in this house with her husband's sister and 2 servants, one of whom is a white Dutch woman and one of whom is a black man. And it's dealing with like the sugar trade and slavery sort of peripherally in the background. And the reason I say that it is of its time is because it is like a girl boss, individualist, feminist historical fiction tale, a Not Like Other Girls story about one plucky girl who saves the day by uncovering secrets, and who is very modern, has very modern ideas and sensibilities, and is not flawed in any way, particularly sort of historically speaking. I can see why you wouldn't want to put those complexities in a book that is ostensibly a historical thriller, but it does make for quite boring reading. I think her characterization is not particularly good. It is simply kick-ass girl boss. It uses the time period as set dressing and doesn't really look into the difficulties of that time period or really evoking that time period. The time period is used just for some narrative like tension rather than really explored. It was also incredibly predictable, like the plot was laid out for you right from the beginning, and whilst things were revealed as if they were to be shocking, I don't think they are particularly shocking. Perhaps they would have been had I read it 8 years ago, but I don't really think so. The other Women's Prize for Fiction shortlisted one that I wanted to talk about was The Marriage Portrait. This is again historical fiction, and I have talked about this a lot, so you probably know why this is on this list. Overall, it was kind of just a mediocre historical fiction book. It was another Not Like Other Girls kick-ass girl boss feminism narrative, but this time published in 2023. It was about Lucrezia de Medici in the 16th century in Italy, and her growing up in this Medici family who are very powerful and very important, but she is not like the rest of them, and she is more empathetic and artistic, really feels for animals, and is very, very sensitive. Her sister dies, and so she gets married to the man who her sister was supposed to marry, who is much older than her. And this is told in dual perspective timelines, one of whom, when she's married and she's going to a hunting lodge and she thinks that her husband is going to kill her. And it didn't have any tension. Like I've already said, the narrative was boring and repetitive. The writing was readable, fine, not particularly interesting. So overall, it would have just been another mediocre historical fiction, but the ending of this one really drove me up the wall, and I know that some of you, it drove up the wall as well. I've had people in my comments saying that they agreed with me about the ending of this one. I'm going to spoil it here, so skip to this point if you don't want to be spoiled. Lucrezia Borgia's husband is trying to kill her, and so she runs away with a artist that she's fallen in love with after meeting once, who is deaf, I believe. I can't remember. And she runs away with him and leaves her maid in her place when she knows she is about to be murdered. She leaves her maid to die. And if it was told in this, look at these fickle, rich people who profess this empathy but ultimately see working class as disposable, isn't this despicable, then I would have had less of a problem with it. But it is entirely triumphant. It is entirely, she managed to escape his clutches, she is this brilliant woman, and the terribleness of her leaving her maid to die in her place, ignored completely. And like, of course, trying to escape from being murdered is something that we can all empathise with, but forcing someone who works for you to die in your stead, I don't think is something that we should be triumphant about. Another one I disliked that was widely loved and that I've talked about a lot is Rouge by Mona Awad. I went on a good long rant about this in my 2023 reading survey, so I'll leave that linked in the cards above if you want the full thing. Rouge tells the story of a woman whose mother has recently died. She had always had a difficult relationship with her mother. They were kind of distanced. Turns out that her mother was involved in this kind of beauty cult, and our main character is also obsessed with beauty and youth, and her obsession with beauty and youth kind of is about a fear of dying and a fear of vulnerability, and also because of her grief she now gets drawn into this cult rather than dealing with her grief, and it is safe to say that I think that I am not a Mona Awad fan, and it's annoying because I know that there is also All's Well, which is a book that I was interested in reading. It's like disability, chronic pain, rep, which as a chronically ill person who deals with chronic pain, it's something I was interested in. It is a Shakespeare retelling. I'm a big Shakespeare fan, and so I was intrigued by that one, but I just don't think I like Mona Awad's writing. I think that Mona Awad's writing is really, really boring. Her descriptions are always just lists and completely flat, and like reading a catalogue rather than reading anything. There's no atmosphere, there's no evocation of anything. I don't understand why people love it so much. This was this colour and this was this big and it's just so boring. And I think her plots are boring, and I think that she doesn't really say anything particularly interesting or mind-blowing. I talked about it being like the Barbie movie, like it's a glossy cover on not a lot of substance, and I didn't like it. Another one that I disliked for being schmaltzy was The Elegance of the Hedgehog by Muriel Barbery, which is translated from French. I read this one for something like fun and heartwarming and enjoyable to read. Instead I found it to be insufferable and twee. It's the story of a woman who is a concierge, and she believes that everyone will look down upon her because she is a concierge, but really she has an appreciation of fine art, and so everybody is stupid for not understanding that she has this appreciation of fine art. And one of the young girls who lives in the building also has an appreciation of fine art and lives with these very stupid materialistic family who are stupid and don't understand her. And so again, it is one of those, we're not like other people, we're better because we like fine art. Kind of a Tory book. Like, it was very much this like cultural supremacy idea of like what is good culture, what is high art, and this pampering of the reader. It's one of the reasons that I don't often like reading books about books, because it has this sort of elevation of reading as this really moral thing to do and this really great thing to do, and it's like, I just enjoy it, I find it fun, it's interesting, but is it really morally superior? I don't think we should be bringing morals into this. It seems like it's just sort of fawning, pampering of the reader as someone who, you get it because you're highbrow like me and you're interesting like me, and it's not like those other people. It's like the whole introverts versus extroverts thing, like, that gets incredibly tiresome because people act as if extroverts are just boisterous nonsense and have no depth to them, and introverts are the real deep people. That kind of a vibe of being super judgmental and super superior in this way that is just ego, and I'm not interested in it. I don't find it particularly interesting. Some of the moments were charming, but for the most part it lacked charm because it was just so superior, and I'm just not here for it. And then the final book that's on this list is The 7-Year Slip by Ashley Poston, which I have decided is the death knell in me attempting to read contemporary romance. I have read several, and I don't think I've got on with any apart from Vari McFarlane, but those are like they are rom-coms, but they aren't romance in the steamy romance sense of things. But even hers, I disliked the one I read of them last year, so like, I've moved on. I think that The 7-Year Slip is about an apartment where every so often it jumps back 7 years or it jumps forward 7 years. You get into contact with someone who is in the apartment 7 years difference from you. And our main character is working in the publishing industry, and she's recently lost her aunt who was like her best friend. And so she is grieving and she's not sure about her job, and she ends up going back in time to meet this guy. In the like today timeline of our main character, she also meets him in a work setting, and they get off on the wrong foot, and she is not sure what's going on because he obviously knows more about her than she knows about him. So it just follows their romance, and I think it just kind of cemented for me why I'm not interested in reading this sort of thing. They all have the same lines, they all have the same moments, and it gets really boring really quickly for me. The style of the writing is always too earnest and always too overblown and dramatic, and I get it. Like, I get it that falling in love feels like you're the only person who's ever experienced this thing, and how are people not talking about this all the time? But like, people are talking about this all the fucking time, and it's not particularly interesting to read about. It's just the same thing over and over again. And I know for some people that is comforting, and that is fine. Take your comfort there. But for me, I find it grating. Also, like, this one in particular was like insta love, and there was not really much between them to build up this feeling. And I feel like for me, I would rather watch something that is romantic than read about it in this way. There's something about like the trauma dump that always happens in romance fiction that I'm just not interested in. I hope you have enjoyed this video of me talking about books I don't like. I always find this video want to talk about it because I obviously have a lot to talk about it, but I find it very draining to talk about 10 of them in a row. So I hope you have found something valuable, and I would love to discuss it with you in the comments down below. I am perfectly happy for you to disagree with me, as long as you're happy for me to disagree back. Thank you for watching. If you are new here, my name's Rouge. Please remember to give this video a thumbs up if you liked it, to subscribe if you haven't already. I put out new videos every Tuesday and Friday, so I will be back again with another one very soon. Thanks for watching. Bye.